Hello, friends. Today's podcast question says, how and when do I talk to my two young girls, ages 3 and 5, about a woman's menstrual cycle? We have already talked with them about gender, sex, and reproduction through your The Talk Made Easy mini-series. Well, for the person who wrote in this question, I am so grateful that you have taken your girls through that series. And if you are listening or watching and you haven't yet used that series or checked it out, and you have children who are under the age of 8, I highly recommend that you check out that mini series, The Talk Made Easy, to begin talking with your children about God's good design for sex. Now, I'm so grateful that this question came in because it's an important one for us to think through, especially if we're parenting girls. We want to ensure that we have this conversation about menstruation before our girls reach an age where they may begin menstruating. So that's the question we're going to dive down deep into today on the Foundation Worldview Podcast, where we seek to answer your questions so that you can equip the children that God has placed in your care to carefully evaluate every idea they encounter and understand the truth of the biblical worldview. Now, as we think through this question, there are two different parts to it. The first part is, when should we begin this conversation? And the second part is, how do we do that? How do we do that in a way that's developmentally appropriate and theologically accurate? So let's dive into the when first. Now, I recommend having the first conversation about a woman's menstrual cycle with girls at some point between the ages of 5 and 8. Now, obviously, in order to begin this conversation, you will have already need to have started the sex talk with them. And those of you who are faithful Foundation Worldview podcast listeners, you know that we recommend starting that talk around the age of 4. So once you've had that first talk, then you can begin talking about a woman's menstrual cycle. Now, the reason that I recommend 8 as being the cap age, the highest age that we wait to talk to our girls about this, is because in the United States, the average age of menstruation, or the first period for a girl, is the age of 11. And then if there is not a father present in the home, that age actually drops an entire year to 10. And so since most girls in the United States are getting their period around the age of 11, or some of them 10, we want to make sure that we have this conversation with our girls before there's any chance of them beginning menstruation. We also want to make sure that they are learning about this part of God's design from us and not from someone else. So I mention this frequently when I talk about talking with our kids about God's good design for sex, that we want to make sure that we establish ourselves as the expert so that our children come to us with their questions. And in order to establish ourselves as the expert, we need to make sure that we are the ones who are having this first conversation with our children. So I recommend at some point between the ages of 5 and 8, having this conversation. That way you're ensuring that you are the first person talking with your daughter about this, and you're ensuring that you're having this conversation before there's any chance of them starting their menstrual cycle. Okay, so that's the when. Now the next question, which is a little bit more complicated, is the how. How can we begin this conversation in a way that's both developmentally appropriate and theologically accurate? So I recommend opening up this conversation with your daughters by reviewing that God designed sex to be the confirmation of the marriage covenant. And in his goodness, God designed sex to lead to babies. Okay, so just review that. You can ask your girls, do you remember what we learned about sex? That's right. We learned that it is the gift that God has given to a husband and to a wife to confirm the promise of marriage. And then ask them, do you remember what can happen? What other good thing can happen when a husband and wife come together and they confirm their promise of marriage through sex? That's right. Sex can lead to babies. And then you're going to want to review how that happens. Do you remember the 2 parts that we learned are necessary from a woman's body and from a man's body to create a baby? Okay, and talk about how it's the man's sperm and it's the woman's egg. And when a man's sperm meets a woman's egg, a baby begins to grow. Okay. So you want to make sure you review that, all of that, the groundwork, and then say, okay, I want to talk to you about another part of this process that God designed. And so then explain that a woman's body releases one egg each month. And then make sure that you explain, because most of our children, their familiarity with eggs is like a chicken's egg, which is vastly different in size and location from a female's reproductive eggs. And so then explain that this is not like a chicken's egg. It's not an egg that comes outside of the woman's body or an egg that we can see with our eye, because this egg is actually tinier than the tip of a pen. And you can take out a pen, and have your girls point to the tip of it and say, did you know that the eggs inside of a woman's body are even tinier than that? And explain that it stays inside a woman's body. It's not like a chicken's egg, that is laid and then either turned into our breakfast or hatched into a new chicken. Explain how it's different. And then remind them that if that tiny egg connects with a man's sperm, a baby begins to grow safely inside of her womb, or you can call it her uterus, whichever term you're more comfortable with. Then explain that many times, in fact, most times that a woman's body releases an egg, that egg does not connect with a sperm. And when that happens, when a woman's body releases an egg and it doesn't connect with a sperm, eventually the woman's body gets rid of the egg, and it also gets rid of the lining in her uterus that was growing to keep a baby safe. Okay, so you just explain this. The woman's body is going to get rid of the egg. It's also going to get rid of the lining around her uterus that God was letting grow there, so that if a baby was formed, the baby would be kept safe inside of her. And then you can explain that this lining and this egg are shed through her vagina. Now, explain that when this comes out, it looks a lot like blood, because it is blood. But when our kids hear blood, they're used to thinking of, oh, this is something that's bad. This is something that's hurt. This is something that means an injury. Explain that this process, it usually does not involve pain. Now, those of you who are women, you have different symptoms with your menstrual cycle. So sometimes it is very uncomfortable, but we want to make sure our girls know that this isn't a scary thing. It's not something that hurts. It's part of God's design for a woman's body to prepare to release another egg the following month. And then you can explain to your girls, you know what, right now, this is not going to happen to your body. This isn't going to start to happen until you get a little bit older. You'll probably be 11 or a little bit older when this starts to happen. Now, especially if you're talking with girls in between the age frame that I just explained, they're probably going to have a lot of questions, because kids 8 and under typically do have a lot of questions. So after you've explained this process in just really basic terms, and you've continued to focus on the goodness of God's design, explaining that all of these things are part of how God has designed a woman's body, then allow them to ask questions. And they might have already asked a lot of questions in between. But as I've mentioned in other podcasts, for when we're talking with our children about different parts of God's good design for sex, our kids might ask us questions that either A, stump us, B, shock us, or C, just flat out surprise us. And so no matter what kind of questions, we're going to want to make sure that even if we're freaking out inside or we're internally confused, that we keep a pleasant face, okay? So that we don't keep them away from asking other questions. So we want to keep a pleasant face. And then if you need more time to think through the question, either because you don't know it or just because you're so shocked or maybe even horrified that your child just asked this question, you need some time to gain your composure, it's okay to not answer it right there. What you can do is you can just say, you know what? I am so happy that you are thinking critically about this. You are using your mind to honor God, and I am so grateful for that. And that is a great question that you asked. You know what? Mommy needs a little bit more time to think about this. So tonight or tomorrow or whenever you have time within the next 48 hours, just say, Mommy will come back and we'll answer that question, and then name the time. What we want to do through this questioning time is we want to make sure that our children feel comfortable coming to us, not only now with their questions, but later when other questions pop up in their mind. So again, no matter what question is asked, be sure to keep a pleasant face. If you need more time, just affirm their question and say that you'll talk about it, whenever, at some point in over the next 48 hours. Now, I answered this question about a woman's menstrual cycle for girls, when to talk about it with girls. For boys, I do not think that it is necessary to have the conversation this early with boys, simply because this is not something that they are going to personally experience. So I think with boys, you can talk with them about it at this younger age. But if you want to wait until your sons are 10 or a little bit older to have this conversation, that's perfectly fine. I would just recommend having the conversation with boys at least by the time they turn 12, because again, you want to be the first person that's having this conversation with them. And so by the time they're 12, their peers who are girls are going to be in the stage where they are beginning their menstrual cycle. And so some of them may be talking about it, in front of your sons. And so you want to make sure that you are the first person to have this conversation. So you can wait until they're around age 10, even age 11, but really recommend that you have this conversation with boys by the time they are 12. Now, for those of you who are thinking, okay, this is a great first conversation, but how do I continue the conversation? Because just like our conversations about God's good design for sex, with our girls, the conversations about a woman's menstrual cycle, it's not going to be a one and done deal. So a resource that I highly recommend you check out is the book called What's the Big Deal? It's part of the God's Design for Sex book series by Stan and Brenna Jones. Again, it's the book called What's the Big Deal, and is written specifically for children, both girls and boys, between the ages of 8 and 12. So that would be a great follow-up resource that once you've had these first few foundational conversations, you can continue the conversation about this part of sexuality as well as all other parts of sexuality with them through going through this book. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. But if you have a question that you would like for me to answer on a future Foundation Worldview podcast, you can submit that question by going to foundationworldview.com/podcast. As we leave our time together, my prayer for you is that no matter the situation in which you and the children God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of His Son. I'll see you next time.